What if I told you there's a group of people in Europe whose DNA is unlike anyone else's? A people whose genetic code is so unique that scientists still struggle to fully explain it. Their language has no known relatives, their blood type is rare, and their ancestry traces back further than most European civilizations. Who are they? Meet the Basques, an ancient population living in the mountainous regions of Spain and France. They have survived countless empires, resisted assimilation, and carried their mysterious language, Euskera, through thousands of years. But their real secret? It's hidden in their DNA. Unlike the French, Spanish, or any other European group, Basques have genetic markers that set them apart, markers that might connect them to Europe's first hunter-gatherers. But how is that possible? Why didn't they mix with other populations like the rest of Europe? And what can their DNA tell us about the earliest humans on the continent? To answer that, we'll need to dig deep into history, science, and genetics, because the story of the Basques is unlike anything you've heard before. Let's dive in. The Basques have puzzled historians, linguists, and scientists for centuries. Unlike most European ethnic groups, they don't fit into the typical Indo-European mold. Their language, Euskera, is unlike any other spoken today. It has no known relatives, no clear origin, and no linguistic connection to Spanish, French, or any other European tongue. But their uniqueness goes beyond language. It's embedded in their DNA. For centuries, the Basques have lived in the rugged Pyrenees Mountains, between Spain and France, in an area known as Euskal. Despite countless invasions, wars, and migrations that shaped Europe, the Basques remain genetically distinct. But how? Most European populations have experienced waves of migration and genetic mixing over thousands of years. From the Roman Empire to the Moorish occupation of Spain, genetics shifted dramatically across the continent. Yet, somehow, the Basques avoided this genetic blending. Their customs remained intact, their language survived, and their genetic code barely changed. That's why scientists call them a genetic time capsule, a living snapshot of Europe's ancient past. But what makes them so different? Where did they come from? To answer that, we have to look at three major theories about Basque origins, because their DNA may hold secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about European history. For years, scientists have debated the origins of the Basques. How did they end up so different from the rest of Europe? What explains their genetic and linguistic isolation? Three major theories attempt to answer these questions, but only one stands strong in the face of modern DNA evidence. One early theory suggested that the Basques might have come from the Caucasus region, near modern-day Georgia and Armenia. Linguists noticed similarities between Euskera and certain languages spoken in the Caucasus, like Georgian and Chechen. Since these languages are also linguistic isolates with complex grammar and unique structures, some believed that the Basques and the Caucasus peoples shared a common ancestor. But modern DNA studies don't support this theory. While there are small genetic overlaps, they are not strong enough to prove a direct connection. The Basques didn't migrate from the Caucasus. Their origins lie elsewhere. Another theory proposes that the Basques are descendants of ancient Iberians who migrated from North Africa around 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. Some genetic markers found in Basques also appear in North African populations, leading some researchers to believe in a possible link. However, large-scale DNA analysis debunks this theory as well. While Spanish populations show some genetic influence from North Africa, Basques do not. In fact, their DNA shows less genetic connection to North Africa than other Iberian groups. The most widely accepted theory, and the one backed by hard genetic evidence, suggests that the Basques are the last surviving descendants of Europe's original Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. DNA studies reveal that the Basques share genetic markers with ancient populations that lived in Europe thousands of years before farming even existed. Unlike the rest of Europe, the Basques have very little genetic influence from the Indo-European migrations that reshaped the continent. Their closest genetic relatives are not modern Europeans, but pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in Western Europe more than 10,000 years ago. This means that while the rest of Europe was transformed by waves of migration, the Indo-European expansion, the Roman Empire, and the Muslim conquests, the Basques remained isolated, holding on to their ancient genes, language, and culture. But why? How did they avoid the massive genetic shifts that affected the rest of Europe? The answer lies in their geographic isolation and their strong cultural resistance, factors that shaped their DNA in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Let's take a look at what modern DNA studies reveal about their genetic uniqueness. Modern DNA studies have provided astonishing insights into what makes the Basques genetically unique. Unlike most European populations, whose genetic makeup has been shaped by repeated migrations and conquests, the Basques have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. Researchers analyzing mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and autosomal genes have found that Basques possess distinct genetic patterns that separate them from their Spanish and French neighbors. One of the most surprising discoveries is that Basques lack significant genetic input from the massive Indo-European migrations that transformed the rest of the continent. These migrations, which began around 5,000 years ago, brought new languages, cultures, and DNA into Europe, but somehow, the Basques remained untouched by this genetic wave. What makes this even more fascinating is that Basques also show little genetic influence from later historical events that shaped the Iberian Peninsula. During the Roman conquest, Latin became the dominant language across Spain and France, replacing earlier tongues. Yet Euskera, the Basque language, survived. Similarly, when North African Moors ruled Spain for over 700 years, they left a noticeable genetic imprint on the Spanish population. But in the Basques, this influence is almost non-existent. Even the large-scale medieval migrations that reshaped the genetic landscape of Spain and France had minimal impact on the Basque people. Scientists now believe that the Basques remain genetically isolated due to a combination of geography and cultural resistance. The Pyrenees Mountains provided a natural barrier that limited contact with outsiders, while the Basques themselves were known for fiercely resisting foreign rule. Their social structure, traditions, and unique language may have acted as cultural shields, preventing large-scale assimilation. This prolonged isolation led to a genetic profile that is not only distinct from their neighbors but also remarkably similar to the DNA of Europe's ancient hunter-gatherers. One of the strongest indicators of Basque genetic uniqueness is their high frequency of rhesus-negative blood. This blood type is extremely rare worldwide but is found at unusually high levels among the Basques. Some scientists believe this could be another clue linking them to Europe's first inhabitants, as rhesus-negative blood is thought to have been more common among prehistoric populations. While the exact reason for this genetic trait remains unknown, it further reinforces the idea that the Basques are a direct genetic link to Europe's distant past. As more advanced genetic research continues, scientists are uncovering even more details about how the Basques remained so distinct. Their DNA provides a rare window into Europe's ancient past, allowing us to see a snapshot of what the continent's original populations may have looked like before the waves of migration and cultural change that shaped modern Europe. But their uniqueness doesn't stop at genetics. Their language, Euskera, also plays a crucial role in preserving their identity, acting as a barrier that has helped protect their culture for millennia. While DNA reveals the Basques' ancient roots, their language, Euskera, is just as mysterious. Unlike Spanish, French, or any other European language, Euskera does not belong to the Indo-European family. In fact, it has no known relatives anywhere in the world. Linguists have spent decades trying to trace its origins, but there is no clear answer. Some have suggested possible links to languages spoken in the Caucasus, while others believe it may be a remnant of the pre-Indo-European languages once spoken across Europe. But no direct connections have ever been proven. What makes this even more unusual is that Euskera has survived despite the rise and fall of powerful empires. When the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula, Latin replaced most native languages, but the Basques held onto their own. Even under the rule of the Visigoths, the Moors, and later the Spanish and French kingdoms, Euskera persisted. This linguistic resilience is extremely rare in history. Typically, when a dominant culture takes over, smaller languages fade and eventually disappear. But Euskera remained strong, passed down through generations in isolated Basque villages. Many researchers believe that Euskera played a direct role in preserving the Basques' genetic identity. Language acts as a cultural barrier. People who share a common language are more likely to marry and form communities within their own group. Since Euskera was so different from neighboring languages, it may have discouraged large-scale mixing with outside populations. This could explain why Basque DNA has remained so distinct even after thousands of years. But Euskera's survival has not been without challenges. Over the centuries, both the Spanish and French governments have attempted to suppress the language, promoting Spanish and French as the dominant tongues. During the Franco dictatorship in Spain, speaking Euskera was even banned in public, forcing many Basques to abandon their native language. Yet despite these efforts, Euskera has endured. In recent years, efforts to revive the language have been successful, with schools now teaching Euskera and more young Basques learning to speak it fluently. The Basque connection between language and identity is a rare phenomenon in human history. While most European cultures have evolved through a mix of different languages, migrations, and influences, the Basques have remained an exception. Their language and genetics have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, making them one of Europe's last living links to its prehistoric past. But with globalization and increasing interaction with the outside world, the question remains, will the Basques continue to remain as distinct as they have for millennia, or will their uniqueness slowly fade over time? For thousands of years, the Basques have remained one of Europe's most genetically distinct populations. Unlike other groups that blended with neighboring communities through trade, war, and migration, the Basques formed what scientists call a genetic bubble, a population that remained largely untouched by outside influences. This level of genetic isolation is incredibly rare, especially in a region as historically active as Western Europe. But how did the Basques manage to preserve their unique DNA when so many other ancient cultures were absorbed into larger civilizations? One of the biggest factors was geography. The Basques settled in the Pyrenees, a rugged mountain range that separates Spain and France. These natural barriers made large-scale invasions difficult, preventing the kind of mass migration that changed the genetic makeup of other European populations. While the Romans and later the Moors dominated much of the Iberian Peninsula, their influence was far weaker in the mountainous Basque homeland. The difficult terrain meant that Basques had fewer interactions with outsiders, limiting opportunities for genetic mixing. But geography alone wasn't enough to maintain their distinct identity. The Basques also resisted cultural assimilation in a way that few other groups have. Unlike many European tribes that adopted Latin during the Roman Empire, the Basques continued speaking Euskera. Later, when Spain and France expanded their territories, Basques still held onto their traditions, governing themselves through local laws and resisting external control. This cultural isolation helped reinforce their genetic isolation. Since the Basques mostly married within their own communities, their genetic makeup remained remarkably consistent over thousands of years. Another key factor in their genetic uniqueness is a phenomenon known as genetic drift. When a population remains small and relatively isolated for long periods, certain genetic traits become more common while others disappear. Studies have shown that the Basques have a lower genetic diversity than surrounding populations, meaning their DNA has been shaped primarily by their own ancestors rather than outside groups. This explains why Basques share such a strong genetic connection to prehistoric European hunter-gatherers while lacking the genetic markers associated with later migrations. While genetic isolation has preserved the Basques' ancient lineage, it has also made them an interesting case study for scientists studying human evolution. Their unique gene pool provides a glimpse into what the first Europeans may have looked like before the major population shifts that shaped modern Europe. But as the world becomes more connected, will this genetic bubble remain intact, or will Basque DNA eventually blend with the rest of Europe? When scientists compare Basque DNA to other populations, the results are fascinating. Despite living in Western Europe, the Basques are genetically distinct from both the French and the Spanish. While their closest genetic relatives are other Iberian groups, Basques lack some of the major genetic contributions that shaped the rest of Europe. One of the biggest differences is their lack of Indo-European ancestry. Most Europeans today can trace a large portion of their DNA to the Yemner people, a group of steppe herders from modern-day Russia and Ukraine who migrated across Europe around 5,000 years ago. These migrations introduced not only new genetic markers but also Indo-European languages, which would later evolve into Latin, Germanic, and Slavic tongues. But Basque DNA shows almost no trace of this migration. This suggests that when Indo-Europeans swept across the continent, the Basques remained isolated, preserving a genetic link to Europe's original hunter-gatherers. Another surprising comparison comes from Sardinia. Studies have shown that the Basques share some genetic similarities with Sardinians, another European group that remained relatively isolated throughout history. Both populations have retained a high percentage of pre-Indo-European ancestry, meaning their DNA is closer to the continent's earliest farmers and hunter-gatherers than to modern European populations. However, there's a key difference. While Sardinians have a strong genetic connection to early Neolithic farmers, the Basques have a much higher percentage of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer DNA. This suggests that while Sardinians were influenced by early agricultural societies, the Basques maintained an even older genetic lineage. Despite their genetic uniqueness, the Basques are still fundamentally European. Their DNA is more closely related to other Western Europeans than to any non-European populations. Some early theories suggested a possible North African connection, but modern studies have largely disproven this. While Spanish populations show some traces of North African ancestry due to historical interactions with the Moors, Basques do not. Their genetic profile remains distinctly European, reinforcing the idea that they are a direct link to the continent's ancient past. These comparisons highlight just how unusual the Basques are. While other European groups have been shaped by waves of migration and cultural change, the Basques have preserved a genetic identity that stretches back thousands of years. But in today's world, where globalization and migration are more common than ever, will Basque DNA remain as distinct as it has for millennia? Or is their genetic isolation coming to an end? As the modern world becomes more interconnected, the Basques face a challenge unlike any they have encountered before. For thousands of years, their genetic isolation was maintained by geography, culture, and historical circumstances. But today, increased migration, intermarriage, and globalization are slowly changing the genetic landscape of the Basque population. The question now is whether their unique DNA will survive in the centuries to come or whether it will gradually blend with the rest of Europe. One of the biggest factors affecting Basque genetic distinctiveness is population mixing. Unlike in the past, when most Basques married within their own communities, today many Basques have children with non-Basque partners. This means that the rare genetic markers that have set them apart for so long may eventually become diluted. While this is a natural process that has occurred in many populations throughout history, it raises an important question. How much of Basque genetic identity will remain intact in the future? Another challenge is the decline of the Euskera language. Language has played a crucial role in preserving Basque identity for centuries, acting as a cultural barrier that limited outside influences. But while efforts to revive Euskera have been successful in recent years, fewer people speak it fluently compared to the past. If Euskera fades over time, it could accelerate the process of cultural and genetic integration, as language has historically been one of the strongest forces keeping the Basques distinct. Despite these changes, some researchers believe that Basque DNA will remain unique for a long time. Even with increased intermarriage, the genetic foundation of the Basque people is deeply rooted in history. The distinct genetic traits that have been passed down for thousands of years will not disappear overnight. Instead, Basque DNA may slowly evolve, adapting to modern changes while still retaining traces of its ancient past. Scientific advancements in genetics are also ensuring that the Basque's unique DNA is studied and preserved. As more people take ancestry tests and genetic research continues, Basque heritage is becoming more widely recognized and appreciated. This growing awareness may help strengthen efforts to maintain Basque identity, both culturally and genetically. The future of Basque DNA remains uncertain. Will their genetic uniqueness survive in a rapidly changing world, or will it fade as globalization continues to reshape human populations? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. The Basques are one of the last living links to Europe's ancient past, and their story is far from over. The Basques are living proof that history leaves traces not just in monuments and texts, but in the very fabric of our DNA. For thousands of years, they have carried a genetic signature that is unlike any other in Europe, a direct link to the continent's earliest hunter-gatherers. Their language, Euskera, has survived empires, wars, and cultural shifts, standing as a testament to their resilience. Their DNA tells a story of isolation, resistance, and continuity in a world that has changed dramatically around them. But as history has shown, no population remains untouched forever. The modern world is bringing changes that previous centuries could not: globalization, intermarriage, and cultural integration. The same mountains that once protected the Basques from foreign influence can no longer shield them from a rapidly changing world. The question is no longer about where they came from, but about where they are going. Will the Basques continue to preserve their unique identity, both culturally and genetically, or will they eventually blend into the broader European gene pool, their distinctiveness becoming a relic of the past? While the future is uncertain, one thing is clear: the Basques are not just a people, they are a living piece of history, carrying the legacy of Europe's ancient past into the present. Their DNA, their traditions, and their language are more than just scientific curiosities. They are a reminder that even in a world of constant change, some connections to the past remain unbroken. Now, what do you think? Could the Basques truly be the last direct descendants of Europe's first people? Or is there more to uncover in their genetic story? Let's discuss in the comments.